Few problems have had a more interesting trajectory through intellectual history as that of the problem of consciousness or mind and its place in nature. Now, before the theory of evolution, this was known, of course, as the mind-body problem. Those of you who've taken philosophy know of its various kinds of rather ponderous solutions. But since the theory of evolution, this has become bared into a scientific problem of the origin of consciousness in evolution. Where could all this interior world that we have and walk around the world with and make decisions with and so on, where could that have come from in evolution? The first important thing I want to get across tonight is this problem, because it's a problem that has been shelved all through this curious period of behaviorism that psychologists have been going through up to the last 10 years when things began to change. And the problem is that evolution says that just with molecules and chance and various mechanisms of evolution, you get all the species that there are in the world. How out of that, how out of mere matter, can you get all this different quality of thing that goes on when we introspect? That is the problem. Now, after the theory of evolution, there were various kinds of solutions to that. There was something called neorealism at one time, in which they felt that indeed one can take the interrelationships of matter and somehow that would turn into consciousness. Something has had a bit of revival when people have tried to understand the paradoxes of quantum physics nowadays. I think a very muddled kind of solution. But then people like Charles Darwin felt that consciousness began with the first one-celled animals and then had this marvelous evolution just as species did. And this didn't satisfy people. And so we had a whole group of people who said that the criterion for consciousness in evolution had to be learning. That was based on a fallacy too. It was a fallacy of the association of ideas. And they felt learning with the association of ideas, so that when an animal could learn, it had to have ideas, and that was consciousness. All very superficial kind of thinking. And then we had something called emergent evolution, which is having another revival today, which really says nothing, but it says something interesting in the metaphor. But first of all, we've got to decide what we're going to talk about. What is consciousness? If I asked any of you what consciousness is, it starts to slip away just as soon as you try to describe it. So I'm going to say first 5 things that I think consciousness is not. Because in your intellectual life, when you're trying to figure out what something is and you're muddled, the first thing to do is to cut away from it so that you get down to something that you know what you're going to be talking about. First thing that consciousness is not is that it's not all mentality, as some people used to think. It is a special part of mentality. For example, right now, you are doing things all the time that you are not being conscious of at all. One of the things you're not conscious of is all the perceptual constancies. Those of you who know a little bit about psychology know what they are. The simplest one is that if you see something in a distance, you automatically correct. You don't think that's a little tiny little animal out there. That is the kind of thing that the nervous system is doing quite automatically. You can multiply that many, many different times for many different kinds of perceptual constancies, and showing that consciousness never enters into any of these things. Nor does consciousness enter into the, let's say, the way you sat down here tonight, or you're not conscious of your toes unless I remind you of it. But it's even more profound than that. Supposing I asked you, am I conscious up here talking to you? Well, you automatically, habitually say yes. But it's not like that. It's quite something different. What I'm doing up here is somehow putting some kind of intentions sort of into my mind, whatever that kind of metaphor, whatever that means, and out comes my speech, out comes my gesture. Do you think I decided to have that gesture at that particular time consciously? No, not at all. Now, do you think you are being conscious of what I'm saying? Actually, if you start to be conscious of what I'm saying right now, the words as they go along, you will not get any of this meaning. Understanding, I hope it's meaning. Understanding is a very, very difficult problem. how we do understand the speech of others. But it cannot be explained simply on the point of view of consciousness, taking it in and being conscious of it. It's a much more complicated thing. What I am conscious of in talking to you is an intention, a meaning I'm trying to get across to you. What you are conscious of as I am talking here is also something about that meaning and intention. A lot of philosophical problems even here that we have yet to work out. But I think we should find other ways of working it out instead of sticking with the bland idea that consciousness somehow does it all. I like to think of the metaphor of a flashlight. That if you ask the flashlight to look around a completely dark room, turn itself on, to see if it was lit, the flashlight would come to the conclusion that light was everywhere, the room was brilliantly lit, when of course it wouldn't be. So consciousness. Whenever you try to be conscious of something, you are conscious of it. You cannot be conscious of what you are not conscious of. And so we get this illusion that consciousness is everything. A second thing that consciousness is not, that we used to think it was, is a copy of experience. I think at least one of the people who started it off was John Locke, back in the latter part of the 17th century. And of course he used the tabula rasa metaphor, a blank slate. But if he were living today, I think he would probably use a camera metaphor. That what we do with consciousness is to go around and take little snapshots of the world and then develop them on reflection, put them together into concepts and so on. But that isn't what consciousness is doing at all. There are many little things you can use to show that that isn't so. For example, supposing I ask you to think of the last time you were swimming. Everybody think of the last time they were swimming. Now, I will guarantee you that 80% of you had a bird's eye view of yourself swimming, something which you've never seen in your entire life. And this should show you that whatever consciousness is doing, this conscious kind of remembering, it's not recreating past experience as you did experience it, it's restructuring it in a different kind of way. You do not take little pictures of the world and then go home and think about them. Instead, whatever conscious memory is doing, it's doing something else besides simply copying, reproducing, and then giving that picture back to you just as the experience was. Very few of you had the feeling of the water going across your face, or the kind of breathing, or the sounds, or the temperature. No, it was something else. So consciousness is not a copy of experience. Third thing that consciousness is not, that we used to think it was very definitely involved in, is learning. And this was, of course, one of the whole theories of consciousness that sort of led on to a different kind of theory about the origin of consciousness and evolution, when animals learned. But we in psychology study learning in three kinds of ways now. We have, of course, what is everybody knows, I think, Pavlovian conditioning or signal learning. We have a number of different terms for it. And we can show not only that consciousness is not involved in this kind of learning, but it sometimes can actually destroy this learning once you know the contingencies of it. But I'll give you one example that I think brings out the point very briefly, is that you can take a cockroach and you can take off its head and leave just the thoracic segment hitched onto one leg and condition that hind leg of that particular preparation. And anybody who wants to tell me that the hind leg of a cockroach that is missing its head and a lot of its other parts is conscious, I think is stretching things a long way. I think that we can show in many other ways that consciousness is not necessary for Pavlovian conditioning. Another kind of learning that we study, of course, is the learning of skills. And if any of you are in track here at Tufts, for example, you will know that sometimes you must not be conscious of all the different parts of things as they are being fitted together. In fact, many track coaches advise athletes not to be so conscious, to let it flow. This gets around to some of the ideas of Zen, if any of you know that Zen and the Art of Archery, that particular book that was popular a few years ago. But you can try this yourself. For example, if you take 2 coins tonight, not now, I think we'd have pretty much of a jumble if we tried it now, but take 2 coins and toss them like that and catch them. That's all. Simple little thing like this. Now, what you will find is that you won't be able to do it until about 10, 12 trials, and then you will learn. Then go over what your consciousness did. Well, what your consciousness was going through is, as you picked up the coins, you'd say, oh, clumsy I am, this is silly, something like that, all that kind of odd kind of thing, till lo and behold, suddenly you've learned it. Now, you haven't been telling your arm, oh, don't throw it quite so hard, or move it here, or anything of that. It's all sort of what they called back in the 1920s when they were studying this kind of learning a great deal. They used to call it organic, because it just happened. It's the way we learn typing. It's the way we learn a lot of things that we do. It isn't done through consciousness. And the third type of learning that we study is what Professor Skinner, our neighboring institution here, calls operant conditioning. I prefer the term instrumental learning, or it could be called the learning of solutions to problems. I'll just give you one instance of kind of thing that I think you can show to show that consciousness isn't even necessarily involved in this. In the Midwest, there was a university in which the psychology professor had given a whole lecture on this learning without awareness, so-called, and he liked to pace sort of in front of the class, just the way I'm doing right now, and the class didn't quite believe all this. So the next session, the next day, they decided that they would test it out on the professor. And whenever he was over on this side, they paid rapt attention to him, laughed at all his jokes, right with him all the time. And as soon as he crossed the midpoint, rustled with the newspapers and everything else, and whispering and so on. Well, back and forth he paced. Well, you can imagine what happened. By the end of the lecture, he was practically out the door without at all. Learning without awareness, learning without consciousness can go on. And the next thing that consciousness is not is a little more difficult to understand. That it is not necessary for thinking or reasoning. Now, of course it's involved in lots of thinking and lots of reasoning in certain kinds of ways, but it is not necessary for it. I'd like to mention the simplest experiment that ever was done in the history of psychology, and yet it is one of the most important. In fact, I think it's historically as important as the Michelson-Morley experiment was in physics that showed that the speed of light doesn't change. A very complicated experiment. This experiment by Karl Marba in 1901 in Würzburg simply had two weights in front of the subject. And the subject was simply to lift the weights this way and tell which one was harder, which one was heavier. And then to introspect on what was going on in consciousness at the moment that this decision was being made. You can try this at home. You don't have to have weights. You have two tumblers, and it doesn't matter if you see that there's more water in one tumbler or not, but you'll get the feeling of this. And it was dramatically exciting when it was really shown very distinctly that there is no process going on in introspection that can be responsible for this deciding thing like weights. You'll be conscious of the feel of the weight of your fingers, of course, and you'll be conscious of the reply that you're going to give, not the problem, but of the actual decision you are not going to be conscious of it. It's suddenly just given to you like that, just as if it were being given to you by your nervous system, which it is. I'll show you a simple little problem that brings out the same thing. And this is just a series of geometric figures, and I'm simply going to ask you, what is the next figure in this series? Terribly simple. Don't make it more difficult than it is. Just put these. I hope that all of you can see it. I'm not sure that you can. Okay, what is the next thing here in that series? And then introspect here on how you got it. Of course, it's a triangle. Now, how did you get that triangle? If you tell me that, oh, well, I saw it was a circle, and then a triangle, another circle, and another triangle, that's verbalizing the whole thing into a lot of words. That isn't the way you solve the problem. You saw the problem once you understood the problem, and then it jumps out at you, the fact that this is a triangle. And if you introspect right here, there is nothing in your introspection that it can account for this. This is hard for us nowadays to understand But it wasn't back then that when the introspective school of psychology was really riding high, and this began a whole new school of psychology called the Würzburg School. And it's a very, very important point that was somehow submerged in what happened later, particularly with the fact that American psychologists did not take this up or read this with any kind of appreciation. So we can find this in simple little things of this sort. But how about something more complicated? Well, I think some of you know that people in mathematics or theoretical physics very often have this same kind of feeling of an answer just suddenly popping out at them. Henri Poincaré, probably the most brilliant mathematician of the 19th century in France, was fascinated with this, how most of his big discoveries in mathematics just would pop out at him at any time. And during World War II, the theoretical physicists in England had what they call the 3 Bs. This is where our physics is done. It's not done in the laboratory or in the university. The 3 Bs are the bus, the bath, and the bed. This is where suddenly we would get big new discoveries. And I had a friend of mine who knew Albert Einstein in Princeton very well. And he had used to shave with an old-fashioned, very dangerous kind of razor of this kind. And he had to be very careful in the morning as he shaved in front of the mirror, because a new idea, a solution to a problem would suddenly pop out at him, and he had to be careful that he didn't cut himself. So even in simple things and complicated theoretical things, the solutions to problems can be done without consciousness. Consciousness gets us into the problem. We're conscious of the answer. But the process of doing it is something that's just beyond consciousness. There's a lot more to say about that, but that's the main thing that I want to bring across on that point of consciousness. If I asked you, where do you think your consciousness is located, most of you would say in your head. Back when I was first studying psychology, I did this to a class, and half of them said here, and the other half said here. So I'm being always bent on a little theory. We, of course, said there are 2 kinds of people who feel their consciousness is here, and the harder type of people who don't feel so much but do more thinking and feel their consciousness is here. Well, right now, everybody, at least all Princeton students, if they are a selected group, I don't know, all place their consciousness up here. This is because, everything from the Anderson advertisements on TV, all of them build up an idea of the brain that in psychology we have a hard time getting rid of. Now, actually, you see, as you were thinking about where your consciousness is, note that tendency to think of me up here, let's say, being conscious that I have a little space inside my mind, right inside my head, right behind my eyes. And particularly if you happen to make eye-to-eye contact with me, this is very, very apparent. If I happen to make eye-to-eye contact with you, I tend to think that behind your eyes is a little space. Somehow, magically, my words are getting in there that you are understanding. But ladies and gentlemen, we know that there is no such space inside your head or mine. There is nothing inside our heads but physiological tissue. And the fact that that happens to be a specialized kind called neurological tissue, called the brain, is quite irrelevant to the point that I am making. I am talking about this funny assumption that we have that consciousness is located inside the head. You could, if you wanted to, while you're sitting here, think of your consciousness as being out there in the vestibule, leaning against the wall, while you're sitting here and doing your thinking out there. That sounds rather strange, but I'm trying to get this point that it is arbitrary where we locate consciousness. It is not a space inside our heads, although we have the illusion that it is, and there are many good reasons why we do. And there are good reasons why we should locate it inside the head, but it is somewhat arbitrary, and this is what I want to make as this final point. But then if we add all these things up, that we do not have to have consciousness to speak, to understand, to learn, to solve different problems, for thinking or reasoning, the consciousness is really not necessary for this. I would like you to imagine that there could be a race of people at some time who could do all these things, but were not conscious. They could do many of the things that you and I can do, such as solve simple problems of various kinds, or talk, or understand, but we're not conscious in the sense of introspection. Introspection is the important thing here, and so what is consciousness? And right now I would like to read, I think this will get us over this hurdle of a rather difficult point. The theory of consciousness that I have come down with and that some of us are working on now is that consciousness is based on metaphor. And the essential thing is that everything you can think about your consciousness is always a metaphor of things that you do behaviorally. So let me just read a couple of paragraphs. Subjective conscious mind is an analog of what we call the real world. It is built up with a vocabulary or lexical field whose terms are all metaphors or analogs of behavior in the physical world. Its reality is of the same order as mathematics. It allows us to shortcut behavioral processes and arrive at more adequate decisions. Like mathematics, it is an operator rather than a thing or a repository, and it is intimately bound up with volition and decision. Consider the language we use to describe conscious processes. The most prominent group of words used to describe mental events are visual. We see solutions to problems. Such as when I asked you what that was, you could say, I see that it is a triangle. Well, you don't actually see. That is a metaphor that you're using for this process of insight. Every word we use to refer to mental events is a metaphor of something in the behavioral world. And the adjectives that we use to describe physical behavior in real space are analogically taken over to describe mental behavior in mind space. We speak of the conscious mind as being quick or slow. Notice how those are metaphors you see of behaving in the external world. Or we speak of somebody being nimble-witted or strong-minded or weak-minded, or broad, deep, and open, or narrow-minded. And so, like a real space, something can be at the back of our minds, or the inner recesses, or beyond our minds, and so on. All of these things, then, are metaphors that are taken over to describe this internal, there's another metaphor, just exactly what I was saying we shouldn't do. What seems to be an internal kind of process, this mathematical operator that we have that we call consciousness. Now, in consciousness, there are various kinds of things that I think go on that anybody can analyze from their own experience. The first thing is this, what I call mind space. If I simply ask you to introspect and to think of different things, it's sort of like a space, and yet, of course, it isn't. It's an analog of this actual space. And this is what we are calling mind space. And in this mind space, you do things. It isn't your bodily self, it's a metaphor or analog. There's a slight distinction here, which I won't go into this evening, but we can call it an analog of your bodily self, which I would call an analog I. Now, this is a different thing, and I put it in single quotes. It's a different thing than the I in which you say I am walking around the platform here. It is something that indeed is what is going on in this operator of consciousness. When I asked you to think of the last time that you were swimming, who was doing the looking? Your analog I was looking in your mind space, and of course I have something called a metaphor me, which is this autoscopic vision, as it's called clinically, when you tend to see yourselves in your own memories in that kind of way. And these are the two most important parts of this way of looking at consciousness. But there's a third important one, which I simply call narratization, which means simply that you are constantly telling some kind of story when you introspect. Don't make too much out of this. When you were looking at your last time you were swimming, you had that a little bit of before and after. You remembered some particular scene, and it was like a little tiny little story. But if I ask you to think of what you're going to be doing tomorrow, it's a narratization. It's like a little story. Oh, yes, I'm going to do this and that and so on. And notice how it's all stretched out in time. So you see this spatialized time in which we are very much of our consciousness goes on, which we have a past and a present and a future. All of that is a part of consciousness. In that spatialized time, we narratize with an analog eye. And this is the basic ingredients of consciousness. Now, you may say, well, it's all well and good to say that this is metaphor and so on, but how could that simple metaphor, how could that build up this thing called consciousness? Well, I have quite a bit of jargon in some of the work that I've done, and I'm going to spare you that this evening. Just let me try to indicate it by saying that when we use metaphors such as see for this insight kind of thing here, notice how insight is a metaphor too, there are associations of this seeing. When I see the lights in this chapel, it's space, full of space. You can't see without space. And so when I say, metaphorically, in my mind or consciousness, I see it as a triangle, these associations of the word see then come back and build in this feeling of spaciousness. I think that happened back, as I'm going to describe in just a moment, back in history, and I think it happens with the young child in a slightly different kind of way. That then is the theory of consciousness which we are working on, and when one does have such a theory of consciousness, and I think that there's a lot more to be developed about this, a lot. And I'm not pretending that this is in any way a complete kind of theory at this point. It is a new direction which we are trying to work out. But now think of what this means about this problem I started off with, about the origin of consciousness in evolution. Consciousness, then, is based on language, since it's based on metaphor. And this, then, means that consciousness had to come after language in evolution. So this is dramatically important, and a lot of things about this that you and I may not like, such as it means that, indeed, animals are not conscious. That's a very hard thing to say about your pet dogs, or particularly if you've been working with chimpanzees and teaching them language and so on. It seems a very, very hard thing to say. But remember what we're saying. We're talking about introspection, about narratizing with an analog eye in a mind space with spatialized time. And when you go back to the 5 things that I started off talking about, the things that consciousness is not, then this will start to click a little bit, and you will see, I think, some of the rationality behind it. So, if consciousness was evolved after language, then the whole shape of the problem is suddenly completely different. When was language evolved? Well, I happen to think it was evolved during the Neanderthal period from about 200,000 BC up to about 10,000 BC. But that's quite immaterial right now, because what happens along in the history of this human species is that along in 3000 BC, human beings learned to take these phonemes and put them down into little wedge-shaped things on wet clay or hieroglyphics on papyrus, what we call writing. And this is a tremendously important thing, and of course it's the way to unlock this problem. Let's go back and look at the first writings of human beings and ask of these writings, are the people depicted in there, or what they're talking about, do they have an analog eye that is narratizing in a mind space? Are they like we are here in this room? Well, the first writings I've just mentioned is cuneiform and hieroglyphics, and hieratic, which is the cursive form of hieroglyphics. And these very often glyphic kinds of writing are still extremely difficult to translate, particularly when it gets to be anything remotely psychological. because then you find that the scholars are, and they will agree to this, are reading in our mentality almost everywhere that they can, because a sign of a good translation is to make it sound like ourselves. And if you go back and look at some of the translations of the so-called Egyptian hymns, make them all sound like the King James translation of the Psalms. It's absolutely not correct at all. So we should go to a language in which we have a continuity and a great deal of study about, where we can be somewhat sure of what we are looking at. And this, of course, is Greek. If we go back then to the first Greek writings, and we're going to ask of those writings, do they have this analog eye narratizing in a mind space? The first writing of any length that we can look at is the Iliad. So let's look at the Iliad for a very brief moment. Well, we used to think that there was a great poet named Homer who wrote the Iliad in his youth and the Odyssey in his old age. Perhaps 30% of modern classicists believe that now, but 70% are followers now of Milman Parry, who threw that all aside and said this is the oral tradition, oral poetry that is passed on in a trance from one bard to another. These bards in ancient Greece were called the Aeoliadoi, and they were a kind of occupation that you can still find going on in places like Kazakhstan, in Turkey, and in some of those countries, particularly in that section of the world. These are bards who go into trances, and they go into long kinds of poems, even today, with some huge epics about World War II, fall of Stalingrad, and things like this. They are not of such quality as the so-called Homeric poems, but they are the same kind of thing. And it's not a kind of poetry that's composed by a poet sitting down, crossing off, and all that kind of thing. It's very different. And this is how these poems should be looked at. And so the Iliad is not by a man named Homer. It is a whole group thing of oral poetry. And when we look at this and ask, is this kind of thing present in the poem? The answer in general is quite shocking. It is no. Now, there are exceptions. If we have Homeric scholars here, they know full well the number of incursions that came later into the poem. And there are many, one whole book is an exception that had come from a later time. And I don't say this on my authority. That would be very weak indeed. I simply say this on classical scholars and what they are finding out about this. And it's very exciting. So we can say that in the older parts of the poem, there is no such thing as consciousness. There is no such thing as consciousness. And so you say, that's impossible. How does anything get done? Well, let's consider Achilles. He's going along, and there's something that has to be done about the Trojan War. He doesn't sit down on a stone and scratch his head and say, well, if we do this, maybe this will happen, and so on. Instead, he hears a voice. Voice usually of Athene, sometimes Thetis, but the voice of a god that he hears, and it tells him what to do, and he immediately does what the god tells him what to do. There is no waiting, no thinking, well, should I do that, as there is later in the Odyssey. In the Iliad, no, it's an immediate kind of obedience. Now, of course, I'm suggesting that these voices of the gods in the Iliad were auditory hallucinations, such as modern schizophrenics sometimes hear in about 50% of cases, although it usually isn't very helpful, but such voices as Emanuel Swedenborg heard, or Joan of Arc heard, or perhaps a number of you, because it's been very surprising to me to find out the number of normal people who occasionally hear voices of various kinds, but don't wish to admit it because hearing voices is supposed to be a sign of being crazy, and so on. But this is a quite common phenomenon, and I'm saying it was far more common back then in not an everyday matter, every hour matter, every decision matter. You heard a voice telling you what to do. Of course, I'm thinking the voice is coming from somewhere in the brain. I am not thinking of spirits outside, or anything of that sort. In most of the cultures that we can look at, we find that the voices seem to emanate from an idol. And that is not so, however, in the Iliad, and yet we know in the historical period of the Iliad, as I have from some of my archaeological friends in Greece, the place was full of idols. So the Iliad as we have it is not really authentic to its bicameral period. But this, then, I've just used the word bicameral without first defining it. This is the bicameral mind. It is a mind that instead of thinking out the way you and I do, and imagining something in the future, or going back into the past and having a reconstructed picture of it as you did in seeing yourself swimming and so on, that instead of doing all that, everything was automatically done for you. You heard a voice coming from inside your brain, but you sort of localized it outside as a god, and they told you what to do, and you did it immediately. This is the bicameral mind, just simply on a metaphor of the upper and lower houses of legislatures in English-speaking countries. It's a very interesting concept to work with, even if you are skeptical at first. And some of the things I'm going to be mentioning from now on, you might want to go back and look up yourself and somehow think of interpreting things this way, because it has a certain kind of power to go back and look at these ancient kingdoms in this way. And we want, having established it, or rather come to this hypothesis of Greece, we want to go back, of course, to the older civilizations that are slightly older than Greece. If we go back to Mesopotamia, which is probably the oldest, we find there very, very good evidence for the bicameral mind. For example, the owner of the land, the king, was the owner. And who was this owner? The owner was a statue, an idol. And the idol lived in a big ziggurat, a giginu, which is a big room at the bottom of it. And what we would call the king was the steward, was this idol's first steward, who would go in with full religious kind of ceremony. And remember, he's not conscious and introspective the way you and I are, so he isn't being logical, he isn't thinking out, why do I do that, and all that kind of thing as you and I might. It's simply automatic, and he hears a voice telling him what to do. There are later cuneiform tablets that actually spell this out quite distinctly and concretely. I went to the statue today, or the idol today, and the idol said this, thus, and so. And so I relayed this to the king. This comes from a later period, about 800 BC, and I think it mirrors what was going on in a much earlier period around 2000 and 3000 BC. And every individual in Mesopotamia had his own personal god, which was his Ili, I-L-I. And in the houses, as we can excavate them, each house had a little sanctuary in the middle, what we would call a sanctuary, with a lot of associations about religion, which would be quite incorrect at this time. This is how decisions were made. Now, if we go to Egypt, it's a slightly different thing, but it is somewhat the same thing. As you know, the Pharaoh himself was considered to be divine. He was the god Horus, and his father Osiris, until he died, and then he became Osiris. It has this complication in it, but you can follow it right down in the same kind of ways you can in Mesopotamia, a whole hierarchy of people hearing the voices of those above them in this hierarchy. And so the average commoner in Egypt had a individual god called his Ka, K-A, and people would name themselves after their Kas. And when a person died, he went to his Ka. We find lots of sayings like this running through the translations of the hieroglyphs. So that is also consistent with this. And so wherever we look, we find, in these ancient civilizations, we find some evidence for the bicameral mind. Civilization begins in the Near East in several sites, spreads throughout Mesopotamia, then over into Egypt and into Crete, and into Greece, and then into southern Russia, probably the Malay Peninsula, and then into China later, and then probably separately arises again in Mesoamerica in the series of civilizations leading up from the Olmecs to the Mayas up to the Aztecs, and then perhaps partly separately but partly by diffusion in the Andean highlands in this series of about 10 civilizations that lead up to the Inca. And wherever we look at these ancient civilizations, there is some kind of evidence that is consistent with interpreting it of people who heard voices telling them what to do. 2 points now I want to make about that. Where did this come from? What do the voices say? I regard the voices as the storing up and processing of all admonitory experience. That means everything your parents have told you, everything your kings and so on. And that there's somewhere in the brain that does store these up and process this in some kind of way. And secondly, why should there be such a mentality as this? Well, I think that there is a reason for this. If we go back in evolution, I've put up on the board here, is that this is the period which I think language was being evolved in, and during this period, human beings went around in bands of perhaps 20 or 25, not more. When they became larger, they broke apart, because the size of this little band had to be so that there could be communication, so you could know everybody else, you see, within the group. This is exactly what a band of gorillas does today, or a band of any of these social animals. Not all of them, there are some exceptions to this. But we have pretty good archaeological evidence that this is exactly what was going on with human beings. The size of the group is dependent on this social control, this hierarchy that is established within the band. Once human beings had agriculture, just about this, 9,000 BC, and the possibility of having larger cities came up, it was stuck on this problem of social control. But once you had, with the learning of language, the learning and storing up of admonitory hallucinations somewhere in the brain that could be ticked off by the problem that was being faced by the individual, which is the bicameral mind, through this period of 9,000 BC up to writing, we had this remarkable development of various kinds of bicameral civilizations. Slightly different in Egypt, with the top human being being divine, but in most other places, the top human being really being the steward of an idol. And if you go back and look at some of these civilizations, it's quite astonishing how this all fits in. But then when we get up to this period, things become a little shaky. This is a hugely successful kind of thing. These farming civilizations worked up into cities of 10,000 and sometimes 50,000, sometimes more. They were very successful. And when we get to this end of the second millennium, right in here, this should be right in here, a lot of things sort of coalesce together. First of all, I should say that the bicameral mind in a big civilization is not all that stable. It breaks down every so often. It's built on hierarchies, you see, right up to the top. If you look at a civilization like the Mayans, we can find that the Mayans were dissolving back into being bands in the jungle every several centuries, and then would get together and build up another huge temple complex somewhere. So their periodicity in the bicameral mind was quite fast. If one comes to Egypt, it breaks down between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and then between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. These are chaotic periods of several centuries in which the bicameral mind seems to be lost, in which the voices of the gods are saying gibberish. We don't know, because nothing comes from these black holes in history as they are. We know the history before and then afterwards, but not during. But the civilization in Mesopotamia is long, lasting, and stable. But then it begins to break down right here about 1500 BC. There are several reasons, as I think, and of course these are just speculation. One of the reasons is because it was getting overpopulated. We find writings that say that the gods are complaining. It's always put in terms of hearing the gods. Even these admonitory voices coming from some part of the brain are complaining about these awful black-headed ones, as we've come to translate how they are called in the cuneiform, how these gods thought of the human beings. They look down on these human beings, something that really lasts for quite a long time, as we shall see. But during this particular time, we had this overpopulation as a problem. We also had writing that, as I said, was developed in 3000 BC. And once you get a king like Hammurabi controlling his kingdom with cuneiform letters sent everywhere, you can see how it's much easier to disobey a piece of tablet with cuneiform on it than it would be a voice inside your head that you can't get rid of. Ask a schizophrenic patient simply to get rid of his voices, and it's just impossible. And this is why a schizophrenic today, which I regard as a partial relapse to this bicameral mind, finds it so difficult not to obey. They finally do learn to disobey, but it's so difficult not to obey these voices which are so commanding. So when the bicameral kingdoms were really auditory, they had this tight hierarchical control. But once we go to writing in 3000 BC, and writing became hugely successful in this millennium right in here, then it helped also the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Other causes, some of you know the whole story of Atlantis, the island of Thera, where I was just a few years ago, in which all the surface of the land went down several hundred feet into the ocean. This was caused a huge new volcano to come up, and then a tsunami, which is a huge tidal wave that broke into all these bicameral civilizations around that part of the Mediterranean, which began a whole game of musical chairs, of migrations of people being lost and refugees and moving in on other people, something that's very, very well documented, going on between 1500 BC and 1000 BC. So all of these things, plus several other causes, all went to sort of hasten this breakdown of this auditory mechanism, if that's what we want to call it, this bicameral mind in which people heard the storings of admonitory information coming to them as voices from some part of their brain, but which they projected outward and felt that indeed it came from an idol or from something else outside of them. This then began to break down right in 1500 BC, and then we have a period that is very, very tragic, full of cruelty, full of war, which is very, very hard to understand because we don't have too much writing that comes directly from it. But we can look at some of the things that happen in various of these civilizations. I wish to talk about three where I think you can see pretty clearly the breakdown of the bicameral mind and the coming of consciousness. The first is where you can see the breakdown very clearly, and this is in Mesopotamia. The evidence for the coming of consciousness in Mesopotamia is not terribly good because it is in cuneiform. But what happens in 1500 BC, or a little bit later, is very dramatic. In the Berlin Museum now, there's a altar like this, in which there's a picture of Tukulti-Ninurta, who was the first really vicious Assyrian tyrant. And it shows him first here standing like this, and then it shows him kneeling, and he's kneeling in front of a throne, and the throne is empty. And this of a throne, and the throne is empty. And this is on the face of this altar. This is never depicted at any other time. No king has ever shown spontaneously kneeling before in human history. There's never an idea of an empty throne. And from the gods being depicted as human beings, a little bit larger than life size, and many, many murals and cylinder seals, all through this period through here, many, many depictions of the gods. Once we get to 1500 BC in Mesopotamia, no. They are either on empty thrones, or else you have funny geometrical symbols, or else you have odd-looking animals, things of this kind. At the same time, you have literature. There's something called the Epic of Tukulti-Ninurta, the first, which says that the reason that some city lost its war and was conquered was because the gods had left that city, specifically spelling out now that the gods could leave their human beings. And then we have a little bit later, but it's practically in the same century, this little belt neckweed, which is this, many scholars think it's the origin of the book of Job, because it's all about this man's tribulations. And the very first 3 lines of it that you can read, because the first tablet is pretty much broken, it says, when will the goddess speak to me as she used to? What have I done wrong that the gods no longer speak to me? When will I see the gods face to face again? Is, even in my saying it this way, is very much like our Psalm 42. As the hart pants after the water brooks, so pants my mind after you, O Elohim, plural for gods. My mind thirsts for gods. When will I come face to face with gods? This kind of psalm-like thing is right there in about 1300 BC in Mesopotamia, particularly in Assyria. And it's very, very like our Hebrew psalms. Well, the bicameral mind broke down, and evidence is very, very good for this. And in its place came a whole lot of things which are familiar to us now, but which never happened before in the history of the world. One of the things was that there were a new conception of where the gods had gone. They had gone with Anu in the sky, and so you have this new idea of heaven, of which there never was any such thing before in human history, the idea that the gods were somewhere else and not on earth, not right beside you. And because of that, we had ideas of angels, brand new idea. These beings that went between the gods in heaven and the human beings and related to them. And then we had, at the same time, the development or invention of a new kind of evil god, which had never happened, namely demons. And demons have this super growth, right around 1000 BC here, until by 800 BC, the average person in Mesopotamia is going around draped with these little lockets and charms and things that have on them, we can translate it, God, somebody protect me from the wind demon Pazazu or something like this. Very strange kinds of things. Suddenly these people were horribly frightened of the unknown and were placing it, you see, in this kind of context of everything still having to do with gods. But probably the most important thing that happens here is a new way of making decisions. Since you can't get the decisions from the gods anymore and you're not quite conscious, how can you make decisions? Well, the divination is the answer. And you find that divination begins at this time. It begins in something so innocent, something you find in the Hebrew Bible of tossing lots, which meant that you took the skirt of your toga or whatever, and you put lots in it, little marked things, and you didn't look and tossed them. And then the one that came out with the markings on it, it meant this, that, or the other. Now, one thing that's hard for us to understand is that there was no concept of chance. You see, we are so used to games of chance and things like this, which are derivative from exactly this kind of thing, that it's hard for us to realize that they had to come to the conclusion that it was indeed a sign of what God was trying to tell us. The reason that the particular little thing went out there was because God was making it to him, or a particular God, I should have said. But this rapidly develops into other kinds of things, like putting oil on water and watching how it moved, plus hundreds of other kinds of things, watching birds, which of course became so important in Rome at a much later time. But the very top two things that were used in Mesopotamia are, of course, expistacy, which means that a priest whispers into a sacrificial animal, usually a lamb, some particular kinds of words to the gods, then the animal is sacrificed, and his liver and all his entrails are examined to look for these signs, and there are whole things which were written about it, about how to interpret these things. And sometimes these innards, I should think they'd be rather redolent after a while, and the sun down there would be sent to the king as proof of what he must do. Very odd for us to think about this. But the biggest one, of course, that became very successful is very successful even now. So all our newspapers, probably the Boston Globe, I'm not quite sure, certainly not the New York Times, not yet, is of course astrology. And you find lots of documentation about just how important these astrologers were during this period of 800 and so on. People like Ashurbanipal, who wouldn't stir out of their palaces unless the astrologer said, no, it's okay, or it's all right for you to eat today, but not all next week. Just this kind of control. We think of these tyrants as being tyrannical, and they're always portrayed this way. But of course they seem like frightened human beings because they are not conscious and cannot narratize with an analog eye. The second place I think we can see the rise of consciousness very clearly is indeed in Greece. And if we start with the Iliad, and then go through the Odyssey, and then Hesiod, lyric and elegiac poets, going through people like Sappho talking about the internal, all those metaphors of love inside of her, and then up into Solon in 600 BC, we can trace out this building of these metaphors very, very clearly in the language of which this poetry is written. It is very, very definitive. And in fact, this is probably the best place to look to see how this kind of metaphor and analogy developed right at this time until Solon is the first person who talks the way you and I do, in which he says, he uses the word mind over and over again, and he's the person that says, well, he supposedly has invented the thing, know thyself, although sometimes that's given to the Delphic oracle. But what can that mean, know thyself, unless you are narratizing with an analog eye, going back through your memories and things of that sort? And he also says, beware of somebody who is thinking in his mind something while he's doing another thing. So there in Greece is a very clear kind of description of where you can look for the evidence for this development of consciousness. The third place is probably the most accessible to all of us, and this is indeed in the Hebrew Testament. If we go back to the history of this, we find that there were, as I was saying, all these refugees of this thing that had happened in Thera, or what Plato called Atlantis, in which you find all these refugees streaming around this particular part of the world. And the term in Akkad, which is the language of Old Babylon, is the word Habiru, which means like a traveler or somebody outside the city that is traveling by. And so these people come to be called the Hebrews. And the story of the Hebrews, but really one particular branch of the Hebrews, is, of course, what is told in our Hebrew Testament. Those of you who know what in the latter part of the 19th century used to be called the higher biblical criticism, know perfectly well that the different parts of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament come from different particular periods, times, places. It was put together first by King Josiah in about 640 BC, although there's some doubt about that, and it seems that later dates are coming in more and more often. But they are from different places and so on. And all of this was sort of fitted together. Therefore, how can you ever use that in the same way that you can use all of Greek literature from the Iliad which on, although there's lots of problems about dating there? Well, one of the things to do is to take those short books that are always exactly, we know what they are. We know they have a specific date because of the kings that they mentioned and so on. And that are short and pure books with very little additions, and take the earliest of those and compare it with the most recent. Well, let me just make one comparison. The oldest is the book of Amos from 800 BC, and the most recent is the book of Ecclesiastes from about 200 BC. And I wish those of you who happen to have Bibles at home tonight, I wish you would go and just take a glance at these things. And I think you'll see immediately the difference that I am trying to paint here between a bicameral person and a conscious person. Amos is not a white-haired, wise old prophet at all. He's probably an 18-year-old shepherd boy that has been found in the fields of Tekoa by some scribes, and he's constantly hearing the voice of Yahweh. And this is terribly important to the Hebrews at this time, this particular part of them. Terribly important to get this authenticity. It's after the breakdown of the bicameral mind, you see, it's 800 BC, much later, but he's been out in the fields where he wouldn't have been so close to the kind of changes in mentality that was going on in the city. And they ask him, is he a prophet? And he doesn't seem to know even what the word is. There's a lot of, incidentally, mystery about the Hebrew word prophet if you go into it in the Bible. And so he's saying this, which said, thus saith the Lord, as it's translated in the King James. And then out comes this huge, forceful speech that, for all we know, he doesn't even understand himself. I feel he was hearing all this admonitory, stored-up information that he probably got from hearing all kinds of stories from other shepherds and so on. And suddenly it comes out with this wisdom, and of course it's all copied down, and this becomes the book of Amos. Now you compare it with the book of Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is a white-bearded old man, and he's full of what we would call wisdom. And he's the person who says, right in the very first chapter, I think, in my heart I see, this use of the word see, I see that wisdom excelleth folly. And he's the person who has such a beautiful spatialized time. It's a time for love, and a time for war, a time for cunning, and a time for harvest. This much too much quoted thing is full. It's a rich, wonderful book. Do take a look at that and compare it with Amos. And then one can go through other kinds of comparisons in the Old Testament, and it all sort of fits in when one remembers the dating of these things. And the dating you can go to either Encyclopedia Britannica or the Anchor Bible. I'm sure there are many other kinds of sources in which you can try to piece these things together. So what I've been doing is to show you a slightly different way of looking at history. And I'm going to close by just mentioning what could the neurology of all this be. If this bicameral mind really is the civilizing of human beings, the one that's the origin of all our culture and civilization, and was this strong, this powerful, what could have been going on in the brain at this time? Well, I think that the simplest answer that anybody would come to, and that I came to, back in the 1960s, as much too simple. I decided to entertain it for a while until I could prove that it wasn't true. And this, of course, would be one side of the brain talking to another. And there seem to be very good reasons for this. We know that those of us who are right-handed, I'm talking right now out of Broca's area here with Wernicke's area, feeding it with meaning and so on. These are the major areas. And yet over here in the right side, there are perfectly good speech areas. Since we know that a child, if I'd been injured as a child here, I would speak with my right hemisphere. The whole speech mechanism can switch over to the right. So here are these perfectly good speech areas over here. What on earth are they doing in our modern life? Why are they there? Just as a spare tire? Or might they be the place where indeed the voices of the gods were being processed and admonitory information was being stored right through time and learning going on there just as well? Well, that seemed too simple, but I've still been with it, because since that time we have all this other kind of evidence that's been coming up from many, many series of experiments until now it's simply a fashion, I'm afraid, to talk about the differences between the right-left hemisphere. Too much of a fashion. We're going to have to backtrack in the future, incidentally. They really aren't that separate in function as some of the more popular literature is sort of painting it as. But what I think was going on was indeed that back in the bicameral times, we had the brain organized that way. It had been evolved that way. Supposing I draw a picture looking down on the brain this way. And we'll call this the right hemisphere, this is the left hemisphere. Billions of cells here connected by several millions of cells in the corpus callosum. And one of the things I liked about this model is here, let's say these are the speech areas here, these are the speech areas here. Supposing we try to think of the integration of these two hemispheres, and this was indeed what really corresponds to the Wernicke's area, the place where all this admonitory processing was going on, how can it get it across to the left or dominant hemisphere? Unless it puts itself into some kind of code to get across these fewer connections here. And what better code has there ever been developed in the entire universe than human language? And this is why the voices of the gods are in language, in order to send it across the brain to this side. Now, having come to this idea, one would want to try to get more evidence. Well, there is evidence that just sort of fits into this. As you know, the evidence comes from various things, but you also all know, I'm sure, about the split brain patients, in which because they had temporal lobe epilepsy that would spread back and forth in here, Dr. Joseph Bogan decided to cut the corpus callosum this way, which then keeps the epilepsy all on one side. And when you do that, you can test out the functions of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere when the person isn't undergoing an epileptic fit. And when you do that, you do find that indeed the right hemisphere is doing functions that are very much like the functions that a god would have to do, such as fitting things into holes, seeing the whole pattern, whereas the left hemisphere analyzes, separates, takes it apart. Some of you may have known or have taken something called Koh's block test, K-O-H, little blocks that you, little designs on them, like a silly little test, and you have to fit them into a pattern. Well, the first so-called commissar atomizer split brain patient I named, well, I better not say his name, but I've seen the films of him in which they give him Koh's block test. And it's interesting, they give it to his right hand, connected to his left hemisphere, and you cannot believe that he seems right to just almost get the pattern and then erase it. It's quite astonishing. And his left hand always has to be held behind his back because his left hand wants to do it. With his left hand, he's better than you or I. Showing indeed that the right hemisphere fitting things into patterns just as the gods had to do in building our civilizations. Think of the problems of making a civilization, getting food from planting it, harvesting it, etc., 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 dividing it up, building temples, all of this kind of thing. Right hemisphere kind of thing. So the gods would have been very good at Koh's block test. And there are other kinds of things that we can look at. For example, as I've mentioned, schizophrenia is a possible relapse, partial relapse, that's all. It's an agonizing thing to a bicameral mind. And if that's so, and they do have big hallucinations, then it should be that the right hemisphere is the one that's involved, and that's turning out to be so in the data, particularly some of the data coming from NIMH that are being done with PET scans, which I won't go into here, but it does show that an hallucinating schizophrenic patient has a huge amount of activity going on in what corresponds to Wernicke's area on the right hemisphere. Well, what I've been presenting to you tonight is something that maybe this is a very appropriate place here at Tufts, this chapel, because all around us are vestiges of this bicameral mind, and here in this beautiful chapel, I understand is just 100 years old, either this year or next to last, I've forgotten which, might be in a very appropriate place to talk about these things. Because whereas these vestiges of the bicameral mind are here in our religions and so on, the other vestiges, like the ziggurats of Ur, have crumbled into the dust, and the gods whose business these civilizations were have migrated from what corresponds to Wernicke's area in the right hemisphere outside the skull into heavens and churches where we still seek them, leaving us with a whole set of new problems. Problems of identity, of who we are, and what we're going to do, and all of our neurotic problems and things of that kind. In other words, leaving us conscious. And if I would leave with you one particular thought to go away with, it is that this is only 3,000 years old. This thing of introspecting in a mind space with an analog eye. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is less than 100 generations. And so I think from that we can conclude that we are all still very young. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll have some questions. Those of you who want to leave, however, because I know that I spoke a little bit over time, but those of you who want to stay and have some questions, well, I'll be glad to field any questions I can. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. You see vestiges of bicameral hierarchical structure in our political system, and in other words, wherever we see a hierarchy, is that a vestige of bicamerality, or is that...
The question was, in modern politics or anywhere that we see a hierarchy, does this mean that this has something to do with the bicameral mind? I think it has something to do with the fact that all social animals are involved in building hierarchies, not just ourselves, but chickens in a barnyard as well as gorillas. So this hierarchical business of social individuals being in a hierarchy keeps down fighting and organizing things. This is common to almost all social mammals. Now, I'm hesitant about saying this, though, about some of the things that go on in politics, but yes, it is related. I'd just like to say it's related rather than being an actual kind of identity. Yes?
Yes, if we're so young, what does our adolescent crisis hold in store for us? What is the future?
If we're so young in consciousness, what's our adolescence going to be? What kind of problems are we going to go through to some great golden future? I could be a pessimist, but I'm not. I am an optimist. I am very interested, let's say, in the human potential movement. This is one thing I'm speaking about tomorrow night in Bedford, Massachusetts, because it's something that I should just pause a little bit to say that some of this human potential movement is just off the slushy end. You know, it's just not exact. It's full of a lot of flaky things. Some of it, though, is quite good. And I think there's an enormous future into people realizing how much they can control themselves and how much perhaps they can change themselves and change their ways of thinking about it. We all know the concept of psychosomatic disease. Well, let's reverse that to psychosomatic health, if we can. It's good. We're going to start here. Positive thinking. That's very good. Yes?
You seem to be focused around Western civilization. Have you looked into Eastern civilizations for things?
I seem to have confined myself to Western civilization, but how about the East, particularly India and China, these supposedly ancient civilizations? They're not. They come long after Mesopotamia. We somehow grew up with the idea that India and China are these really old civilizations, but civilizations happens in China really about 1200 BC, quite a time after these huge cities were here. India is a little bit older than that, but not much. But another problem comes in getting sufficient materials, because in India and China there hasn't been this sense of time and history that we have had. And particularly in India, many of the Veda and Upanishads, some of the greatest of them, were not written down until 1850 A.D., when these British colonels went down there with into India to rule and didn't have anything to do, and became scholars of this material and took it down. That was still being repeated in the temples orally. And so it isn't as authentic to its time. And somewhat the same thing in China, but as you perhaps know, Chinese archaeology is zooming right now. The new regime, this is part of their whole thing to give that historical basis to China. They're making some mistakes in it, saying that there was never any diffusion from Mesopotamia, but most scholars don't quite agree with that. That doesn't matter. They're discovering just loads of stuff that's been buried there. So we'll be able to deal with that much better than we can right now. But I think the same things went on. If you compare the Veda and the Upanishads, you find the same things between a non-conscious kind of literature, people hearing voices, and a very conscious literature. And if you take the Chinese, there isn't any really bicameral literature in Chinese because we're suddenly there with Confucius and the I Ching and things like this. But there are other things like idols that make us think that indeed they were bicameral about 1200 BC in the Shang dynasty, and then things began to change. Yes?
Do you have any hypotheses on why and when consciousness occurred in detail?
Yes. The question is the question that really should take a whole other lecture about the development of consciousness in children. Just let me say that I am trying to investigate this empirically with some of my students, and it is not an easy thing to do. But remember what we mean by consciousness. It is the ability to introspect, to have this narratizing ability, to think before and after. And if anybody here has children, you certainly know how and sometimes you would say to a young child, now think out what you're going to do. Stop and think a little bit. Or you might remind the child, don't you remember what we did last time? Remember this place? Remember that? Sort of training memory in and so on. These are empirical questions that I think we have to do a lot more studies on. I can just give you one little example that came from my being in a restaurant in Princeton, where I just saw a little boy, I guess he must have been 6, tagging along behind his mother, who seemed to be cross with him, as she went up to pay the bill, and he just simply tagged on her coat and said, "Can I say it in my mind?" And the mother turned around crossly and said, "Yes." And the little boy just stood there, and he saw a glaze come over his face. So we turned that into an experiment. We started doing various things and finding out when children can say things to themselves or sing things to themselves in their minds. It turns out to be about 4.5. And it's pretty clear. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean consciousness? I'm not sure. We still got to work at it. Yes?
Yes, when you show that the mind of consciousness developed, wasn't like our mind, as we are with the mind, perhaps necessary and would make them more fit. I mean, certainly if the body is not faster, it would make them more fit if they want being able to.
Yes, it does. It has tremendous survival value. But I don't think it is based on biological genetic basis. However, if you're a follower of V.O. Wilson, he has recently come out with some statements that, gee, it can be something like 1,000 years in which you can, only 1,000, which you can change the gene pool a little bit. But I have not been convinced about this, and I don't feel that the time intervals involved here are enough to say that this is an evolved kind of thing. Oh, but I'm very sure that those individuals since that time who were conscious and could get along in our conscious society are those people who indeed would reproduce themselves more, and others who couldn't would not. But there are a lot of problems there. I don't like to base my case on evolution, because that puts it into darkness again. I mean, once I can say consciousness is evolved and it's innate in the child, then you don't have to do any investigation anymore. It just sort of grows. Instead, I'm taking a more radical position at present, saying that indeed it is learned, and we want to find out how it is learned in children. Yes, sir?
You said learn generation to generation. Does this imply that there are bicameral groups of individuals today in contemporary gathering societies within?
Are there any bicameral people living together today, such as in hunter-gathering societies? Let's say hunter-gathering societies, I wouldn't say would be necessarily bicameral simply because they wouldn't have to be. If they're a small enough group so that everybody knows everybody else, as most of these bands are, that's all. But let me answer the question directly. The answer is no. The last two possibilities have recently been destroyed. They were two bands in the Amazon. And I would have thought that they probably wouldn't have been conscious, let alone being bicameral. See, it sounds, even now, you forget the first part of the lecture, so it sounds a little odd and strange, doesn't it? But it was remarkable. But now the Brazilian government is moving in there, and they're doing the farming and everything else there. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of things to look for. I tend to think that there were many bicameral civilizations going on. In Africa, for example, there was the Nok, the N-O-K, back around 500 A.D. We're just digging up the idols that they used. Well, to me, this is almost by definition that they were bicameral. And then what you find is that they had breakdowns. And so what each hunter-gathering tribe has now is a whole history, as long as ourselves. And many of the practices that they have that perhaps came from a time when they were a part of a bicameral kingdom. And I feel that's an interesting hypothesis to see if we can have a really archaeohistory or something where we could go to a hunter-gatherer group and try to get back at what it was like 1,500 years ago. We're dealing with pretty long periods of time here. That's a very good question. Yes?
You said that very briefly in passing. You mentioned chimpanzees. I recently read this particular book by Philosophy, in which he mentions, talking about the work of chimps and trying to intercommunicate with them, that if we ever manage to, we'll have to take it very humbly because it will be vague before our language. They'll be the first species to learn another species' language. Well, without having to buy into that, since you did mention chimps, I wonder if you have anything to say about interspecific language or about what the consequences are in mind of other species acquiring language.
One of my former students from Princeton here. Good question. And how am I going to answer it? In the use of the word language, some people use it very loosely. Talk about bees language, things like that. I don't like to use it that loosely. Communication systems. Chimpanzees have huge communication systems full of gestures, cries, and everything else. So I wouldn't like to talk about us learning their language, although I have friends of mine in Philadelphia Zoo who do just this. They've learned all the different ethological signs and go into the chimpanzee cage and communicate with them. But it's not the communication of information, it's the communication of emotions and feelings and things of this sort. Now, if we get back to the groups of people that have been trying to teach chimpanzees language, the gardeners and Wyoming and we'll go through the whole group of them, which there's still a great deal of controversy. It is very interesting, particularly if we could get a female chimpanzee to teach it to her young, which has not happened, although they're looking for that. Or one that would go back into the wild and try to teach it to others, and nobody's tried that. It seems to fade out in the chimpanzees unless it's constantly reinforced. But I'm sure the consequences of it would not be overwhelming. I think for the individual animal, consequences are things like increasing perceptions. I think our words for things increase our perception. If I have a word for lectern, one can see it more clearly. And so I think that particular Washoe would go through a magazine and make signs about what the things were. And I'm sure it made it much more attention getting to him than a chimpanzee looking through the magazine probably wouldn't have paid much attention to. So I'm really not answering, I think it's probably something more profound in your question that I may not have gotten, but that's about the best thing to do. Yes?
Here seems to discredit the reality of religious experience before consciousness. If you could just give me your opinion on the reality of religious experience after consciousness.
Does the theory that I have said destroy the reality of religious experience? Let me just describe to you a letter that I received from a theologian in a Southern Baptist college, where they were reading my book, and indeed my book was being damned as the Antichrist, and most of them wanted to burn it. But anyway, he was very nice. He said, I don't want you to think that even of yourself, because here's how it all fits together with me. Assume there is some kind of God that we don't know very clearly, a God that can create in time, although time doesn't exist for him, create in evolution and so on. That then slowly, step by step, reveals himself to human beings in a series of successive steps to get the human being to where he wants the human being to be, remembering that there is no time in God. Then, first of all, he has human beings evolve language here. Then he reveals himself to each individual as their own individual personal God. Then he turns to monotheism with Moses and others, even Akhenaten, for example, can be brought in here. Monotheism wasn't something that was going on at this period, but there being one God, not many. And then we have the prophets who are relating God to human beings. Then the end of the prophets comes, which I think this theory explains, and I don't think any other one really does, and why the prophets should suddenly die off. And then, because he's a Christian theologian, God comes to earth in the person of Jesus, who goes then through a human life and is trying to teach more about God's purpose to human beings, and then is crucified and died, and then is forcing human beings to relate to God in terms of faith, evidence of things unseen, as Paul says. And that all of that, you see, can fit into then a Christian interpretation, if you want to think of indeed a God outside of all this. So, I don't want people to think that I'm trying to be anti-religious in what I've been saying. With someone who hasn't answered the question, I'm going to go right back. Yes, madam.
What people were right left are operating both.
Yes.
And it occurs to me that you say the experience of the scientists, the bus, the bath.
Right.
That sounds like right now.
All right.
And isn't some sense that perhaps there are some, I mean, the way you started is that right load is lower level, but isn't there reason to believe that the right load is a repository of some thinking that, holistic,
Yes.
and perhaps
Yes.
flash that goes beyond the linear conscious.
Right. Yes, what the lady has been saying is a sort of an additional thing to such theorizing about that these flashes of things that can come to Henri Poincaré or Einstein or, let's say, Mozart.